you guys about the French Revolution. It's what we're going to be talking about this week. And today I'm going to talk about the causes, everything that led up to the French Revolution. Hey, Rose. Hey. So the French Revolution basically eradicated the old regime or the old way of life and replaced it with what so-called modern society. And this is a really big deal. The revolution was a really big deal in Europe. Because imagine you're in Europe, you're watching France, which is the most powerful, the most aggressive country in Europe. It's got the biggest population, about 24 million people, which is about the size of modern-day Texas. It's also one of the military strong-houses. Their involvement in military affairs would often be decisive. And they had even more exports than Great Britain. So you can imagine that when the revolution broke out in France, this was shocking to Europe. People were either shocked or they're excited, depending on their persuasion. But the revolution was a big, major event. And this week, you guys are going to be studying what happened during the revolution, its aftermath, and the influence of the revolution. But again, today we're going to focus on how come it happened to start with. So I mentioned that the revolution is going to eradicate the old regime, basically the ancien regime. That just means pre-revolutionary society. This is a picture. There's lots and lots of variations of the same idea of the three estates. Essentially, the old regime was divided into three social estates. The first estate was the clergy. The second estate was the nobility. And the third estate was everybody else. That meant merchants, wealthy professionals, peasants, wage earners. Everyone else is lumped into the third estate. And as you can see by this depiction, there is some social inequality. And we're going to talk a lot about the class struggles, because this is one of the causes of the French Revolution. So here's a breakdown of the numbers. So you can see most people were in the third estate. The first estate, again, that was the clergy, was only about 100,000 people. The second estate was the nobility, about 400,000 people. And that left everyone else in the third estate. Remember, we talked about how the population was 24 million, about the size of Texas. So about 23.5 million people were in the third estate. But the problem was that this breakdown into three estates, it wasn't fitting reality anymore. For instance, the wealth and the productivity, the involvement in France wasn't necessarily in the first and second estate anymore. What was happening is you were getting members of the third estate. The upper crust of the third estate was known as the bourgeoisie. They were becoming more powerful and even sometimes more wealthy than people in the second estate, or the nobility. So we're going to see how there's class struggles going on in the 1770s and the 1780s leading up to the revolution. So socially, this breakdown into three classes is somewhat obsolete. It no longer makes sense. And politically, it didn't make sense either. There was this institution, it was a semi-representative institution called the Estates General. So remember this term, the Estates General, because it's going to come up again on the eve of revolution. The Estates General was this semi-representative institution that could only be called by the king. Representatives of the three estates would get together and maybe pass policies or decide what to do when there's a financial crisis, for instance. But the Estates General, it hadn't met since 1614. And we're in 1789. That's when the revolution broke out. So politically, this breakdown to the three states, it was obsolete too. So socially and politically, it just wasn't making sense anymore. But the old regime, the three estates, mattered because your social prestige and your legal rights depended on which estate you belonged to. And again, there was privileges that the first and second estate, the clergy and the nobility, you can see they're here, they're kind of aligned with the king because they're fancy schmancy, they're wearing nice clothes, they're above and happy and free. And they're riding on the third estate, which is enslaved and starving. Like, these guys are fat because they're eating a lot. And the third estate is just not as happy. There's social inequality. And it's because of the prestige and the legal privileges that were going along with the first and second estate that the third estate didn't enjoy. So this is how come it's important. And the revolution is going to get rid of this old system of ordering society. So a lot of the, so there's three states, and there's a lot of class struggles between them. So first I'm going to talk about one example. There was class struggle between the nobility, or the second estate, and the rising bourgeoisie. Again, that was the upper crust of the third estate. So these two bodies, they're going to be both rising at the same time, and there's going to be some clashes. So we'll talk about that first, and then we'll talk about some more of the class struggles that happen. So this is a picture of Louis XIV, or the Sun King. If you guys remembered, he's the Sun King. He's at the center of attention. He was really able to curb the power of the nobility, keep them entertained at Versailles, while he and his advisors were running the government and making the administration happen. And he was very, very much in charge. And so he was able to curb the nobility. What happened was, he died in 1715, and his successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI, weren't able to curb the nobility as well. And so in the 1700s, you get a resurgence of the nobility. So they're rising back in power. What I mean by that is that the nobility, they are getting the highest posts in all forms in all parts of society. They have the highest military posts, government posts. They're even in the clergy. There's a difference between the upper clergy and the lower clergy. And they were getting all the best posts and also all the privileges that go along with them. They were getting all the honors. And they want to say politically too. They're starting to flex their muscles. By the time we get to Louis XVI, he was the last king. He was the king at the beginning of the revolution. You guys are going to study what happened to him. So by the time he's in power, the nobility is starting to flex its muscles again. And it wants a political say. Because remember, what sort of a government was France at this time? Do you guys remember? Yeah, absolute monarchy, meaning the king gets to call all the shots. And there was not really any political voice for anybody else. And so this resurgent nobility is going to want more say in the policies of the government. We're going to come back to Louis XVI because he's kind of he's a character because he's very inept. He's sort of ignorant, not charismatic, undecisive. So when you have an absolute monarchy, the strength of that government is going to depend on how good and strong that absolute monarch is. And he was not that great, especially when you compare him to Louis XIV, for instance. And so you've got this rising nobility. They want a political say at the same time that you've got an inept ruler. So you guys can kind of think about what's going to happen there. So meanwhile, you've got this rising nobility, but you also have a rising new bourgeoisie class. This is the upper crust of the third estate. They, in the 1700s, the bourgeoisie is getting increasingly wealthy. That means like merchants and lawyers and all the government positions that go along with trade, because trade is expanding in the 1700s. So you've got new wealth, a new social class. And they're also becoming more powerful and self-aware and self-confident, better read. And they're going to want to stay in the government too. So you have two rising groups in the 1700s. Both of them want a political say, but you have an absolute monarchy. So that's going to pose an issue. At the same time, who do you think they resent? They are newly wealthy, but they're still in the third estate. So who do they not get along with? Yeah, so there's going to be class struggles between the upper crust, the third estate, and the first and second estate, especially the second estate, the nobility. Why? Why do you think that?
Well, because their second and third estate, which is one's less privileges, and they want to rise higher.
Can you all hear?
No. That's exactly right. Say it louder.
Well, they're still in the third estate, they don't have the privileges of the first and second estate. So they resent them and are trying to thrive, but can't because of the first two estates.
Yeah, excellent. So the third estate is, especially this rising group, their economic power has outstripped the old social order. So the new capitalism, merchants, trade, all of that is creating a new social class, the bourgeoisie, who wants some of the privileges and and they want political power, but they can't get that. They're held back because of this estate system. So some of the privileges, what's your name?
Jane.
Jane. The she alluded to that the first and second estate had privileges. So some examples, for instance, they didn't have to pay, the clergy paid no taxes, and the nobility didn't pay income tax. So they didn't pay the most direct basic tax, which meant that most of the taxes were on the third estate, including the bourgeoisie. But that couldn't be the whole answer because the bourgeoisie, there's tax loopholes. Just like today, wealthy people can get around the tax system. They can have tax breaks too. And the bourgeoisie were smart enough to get tax breaks as well. So the whole problem couldn't just be wanting tax breaks. A lot of it had to do with the nobility, the second estate and the first estate. They were just snobby. They had hoity-toity ways of being. There's social etiquette that existed in the old regime. And the bourgeoisie really resented that because they didn't see why are you superior to me? Why do I have to treat you in a certain way? Why aren't I as good? And they also, of course, they resented that they weren't getting the best government jobs or the best honors because the nobility would get it just by privilege, who they were. And they wanted it out of merit. So, again, you're going to see this class struggle between the upper crust, the bourgeoisie of the third estate, and the more privileged estates, like the nobility. So you're going to see these two rising states, socially and politically, when they collide, you're going to see that that's one of the causes of the revolution. And meanwhile, both of them want a political say, which is not possible in an absolute monarchy. Here's another picture depicting the poor third estate bearing all of the burden while the clergy, who's represented by the monkey, and you can't quite see, but there's a doggy right there, that's the nobility, they're harassing him. So the poor third estate, 98% of the population, is in this lower class. And so you're going to see that not only were there class struggles between the bourgeoisie and the nobility, but there's also class struggles between everyone else in the third estate. There were, remember, peasants and wage earners in that estate as well. And they're going to have grievances also. Usually for them, it's going to be economic and social more than political, because the first things on their mind is, okay, I need enough food to eat. I want more social equality. So the common people in France, they probably weren't all that much worse off than their counterparts in the rest of Europe, but within France, there definitely was social inequalities. They saw the privileges of the second estate, of the nobility, and they also saw, the rich bourgeoisie, and they wanted to partake in that as well, because what was happening in the 1700s, the cost of living rose by 65%, but wages only went up by 22%. So if you're a wage earner, meaning you get paid by the hour, you're increasingly pinched because food's costing more and your cost of living just costs more, but you don't have as much money to pay for it, relatively speaking. And so that causes unrest. And it's true that there's probably more wage earners today than there used to be because there was people selling things on the free market, like artisans and farmers. But there is enough wage earners that contributed a significant proletariat or wage earner element to the revolution. So you're going to see that their economic and social grievances are also going to be really important as a cause for the revolution. So who else? Who have we not talked about yet? Yeah, the other people, because the third estate is so big, 98%. So we talked about the bourgeoisie, the upper crust, and we talked about how the wage earners feel. But the rest of the people are agrarian, they're farmers. 4/5 of the population in France in the 1780s was rural. And they're going to have grievances as well. So you're seeing lots and lots of unrest is happening in the 1780s, and all of this is going to combust. So we're going to see how it all unfolds. So this is a picture of just a peasant family, and they're farmers. They live in the countryside. So at this time, serfdom, it didn't exist in France, meaning that the peasants didn't have to work for a lord, but there's still a bunch of trappings of vestiges, leftovers of the feudal system that made the peasants unhappy. So we're going to talk about a couple of those. So do you guys know what a manor is? Yeah? What is it? Branson cross country. Next to Sophie. You.
Oh,
What's your name?
sales?
Sales. Oh yeah, you're Mr. Henderson.
Yeah.
So what is a manor, Sales?
It's a big plot of land that was managed by
The manor lord.
the lords.
Yeah, exactly. It was a big plot of land in the countryside, and once upon a time, that was a unit of government. So the manor lord would perform some local government functions, and it had a purpose. It did something. But we're in a centralized modern state in the 1780s. That replaced the functions of the manor and the manor lord. But remember, in the old regime, there's still trappings of that old system. And that's where the problem was. Because the manor lord was not really doing anything productive, not really managing the local government, not being economically productive, but he was living a privileged life. The manor lord was getting all sorts of benefits just by being a noble, a manor lord. And that's where the unrest came from. The peasants really resented that. So some of those privileges included hunting rights. Doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but imagine if you own your land and all of a sudden someone comes traipsing across with guns and horses and foxes or whatever. The manor lord was able to do that. They could just hunt on peasants' land and their own land. So that was one of the privileges they enjoyed. Moreover, they got to collect fees for basically everything imaginable. The local mill and the bake shop and the wine press, things that peasants need on a day-to-day basis, the manor lord would collect a fee every time a peasant wanted to use it. But in exchange, the manor lord wasn't really providing anything. And so you see what's happening is that the old regime, the old system, and these feudal vestiges, the trappings, they didn't make any sense anymore. But the manor lord was getting all the privileges anyway. So I also said there is no really economic function of the manor anymore because it's not like plantations in America where the person managing the plantation owner was productive, they were selling crops or cattle. These guys, the manor lords in France, they were just living off the fees that they were collecting from peasants. And so that caused a lot of resentment in the countryside. And they were collecting dues for everything, like I said, imaginable. And so you can see what's happening is that in the countryside, the peasants, just like their wage earners counterparts in the city, they're both getting under more and more economic pressure in the 1700s, especially towards the 1780s. And meanwhile, there's bad harvests, famine, and that always causes unrest too. So all of these things together are going to become explosive. All right, so again, you're seeing economic elements. We've talked about some of the social elements, and now you're seeing that some of the economic elements behind the French Revolution. How come it happened? So this chart, it talks about the population breakdown in land ownership. So I mentioned earlier that the population, about 24 million, about the population of modern-day Texas. And most of that was the third estate. And the tiny, tiny little sliver, 0.5%, is the clergy or the first estate, and 1.5% is the second estate or the nobility. But compared to land ownership, you can see that there's some inequality. The two smallest estates, the first and the second, disproportionately own a lot of land. So for instance, the clergy, 100,000 clergy, they own 10% of the land in France. That makes them the single largest landowner in France. And they only, they're this tiny, tiny amount of the population. Same thing with the nobility. But what do you also notice? What do you notice about the distribution in numbers? Is it surprising to you? Would you think that the nobility actually owned more land? Yeah. So you can see that so even though it was unequal, disproportionate ownership, there's actually land ownership was somewhat widespread in France. But again, you're going to see the problem was that there was the old property system and the old regime didn't really match up with reality. There was a lot of old trappings and privileges that the first and second estate got that the third estate didn't enjoy. And so that's going to cause, again, economic unrest. Because this third picture, government taxation, third estate. So the church refused to pay taxes on its land, and then the nobility got tax exemptions as well. So that meant that the tax fell on the third estate. And land was a big deal. It was a major source of income and property ownership. So this is definitely a really big deal, who owned what. Okay, so we're going to see again how the property system was archaic. It was not suited to the changing times. So this is a picture of what it used to be like in feudal times. There was a manor house, and then peasants would work it. But as I told you, the feudal system no longer existed. But there were still some privileges that the first and second estate enjoyed. So besides the tax exemptions and the fees and the hunting rights that we already talked about that the second estate enjoyed, they also got eminent property rights. Does anybody know what that means, eminent property rights? I only learned when I was second year in law school, so no idea? All right, so what it meant is that lesser landowners, people who weren't the manor owner, they still could own property, meaning they could buy it or sell it or inherit it or bequeath it, leave it in their will. They were allowed to do that with the property they owned. But the catch was that the manor lord enjoyed these eminent property rights. So that meant that every time the property of a lesser landowner changed hands, for instance, if I want to sell you my land, I have to pay a fee to the manor lord. So every village had a manor, and I would have to pay a fee, just because he existed, not because he did anything. Also, every year I'd have to pay rent to him, just because he existed, not because of any function. And so these old eminent property rights, the bourgeoisie and the lesser landowners like peasants, they really resented that. And again, you're going to see this is class struggle. So one thing that the revolution did was wipe away those old property rights and make property more modern, without all those trappings like eminent property. Here's France. So we've been talking about a lot of these political and social and economic tensions that were occurring in France. But you have to remember that France is a unified political entity at this point. So it's different than, say, Italy, which has a bunch of city-states, or Germany that has a bunch of principalities. France is unified. So that means that you can have nationwide agitation or policies, a nationwide movement. And this isn't possible in the rest of Central Europe at this point. So what you're going to see happen is that revolutionaries were taking the sense of membership in France as a nation. People already felt like they belonged to something. The revolutionaries are going to take that sentiment and turn it into a desire for civic rights, for citizenship, for belonging, for fraternity. So you guys have heard that catchphrase, égalité, liberté, fraternité. The revolutionaries were able, so that means equality, liberty, fraternity. The revolutionaries were able to take this already national sentiment and turn it for their own ends. And that's really important. So keep in mind that you've got a nation here. And on the eve, at the brink of the revolution, people were yelling out to each other, calling each other citizen, hello citizen, or vive la nation, long live the nation. Okay, so what else is going on? Do you guys recognize this photo or picture, painting? Who's in it?
George Washington.
George Washington crossing? Yeah. So the American Revolution happened in the 1770s. And the French, the nobility and the bourgeoisie, those people who are agitating, who want some political say, they pay really, really close attention to the American Revolution. And France sent a lot of money to, they aided the American revolutionaries. Because who is France's biggest rival?
England.
Yeah, and so they want, whatever can hurt Britain is good for France. And so France helps. They send a lot of money and personnel to America to help the revolution. And so that means that the people who got sent over there, like French nobles, they were getting exposed to the ideas of the American Revolution, the principles, even just the possibility of revolution at all, that really influenced the French. And they admired, like this is so heroic, and they were bold and rugged. They were breaking away from a decrepit Great Britain or old regime. And so the French who wanted something new, they were really inspired by the sense of freedom that America represented. And when they looked back to Louis, with his fancy clothes and his fancy court at Versailles, they didn't see that same sort of rugged, patriotic, heroic leadership that they wanted. So coupled with the American Revolution is the Enlightenment, which you guys studied before the break. So Enlightenment thinkers really gave voice, or the Enlightenment ideals really gave voice to this unrest and the sentiments of the revolutionaries. So you've got Rousseau and Voltaire. Who played Rousseau and Voltaire? So what did, were you Rousseau or Voltaire? Rousseau, what are, in a sentence or two, what are some things that Rousseau championed?
Social contract.
Which means what?
That people should band together to try and protect their freedom from the government or from other things.
Yeah, so you've got this idea of individual liberties that need to be protected, that the government's supposed to protect. And Voltaire, Anna, what did Voltaire stand for?
Equality and the freedom of thought and freedom of religion and that kind of independence to formulate your movements.
Good, excellent. So ideas like reason and liberties, these ideas were influencing revolutionaries. And again, the Enlightenment really gave voice to some of their sentiments because now you could use reason to criticize the unjust social structure or the privileges that didn't make any sense anymore. And so the Enlightenment also clashed with Bossuet. Who's Bossuet? Who is a Bossuet? Yeah, and what did you stand for?
Pretty much saying that religion is rule over the state.
Yeah, so religion and also what did you think about the kings?
That the kings have absolute power.
Yeah, because?
Because they have the right to be God.
Yeah, so divine right theories. They stood at odds with Enlightenment thinkers. But it would be wrong to say that the Enlightenment philosophers, it would be wrong to say that they caused the revolution, because a lot of them were actually just social reformers. They weren't revolutionaries themselves. But nevertheless, their ideas gave a new form of criticism for the social and political policies of the old regime. All right, so in the last decades of the old regime then, you're seeing that there's mounting tensions, and there's also new ways for people to express themselves, more ways to criticize, and more ways to learn and educate each other. So people, the journalists in France were writing about the American Revolution and about the ideas that were generated from that, but also they were trying to sway public opinion. So they want to trash the old regime. They want to publish just really scandalous stories. They want to make it seem that the people at Versailles, the courtiers, the hangers-on to Marie Antoinette, oh, she's the queen. Marie Antoinette is married to Louis XVI. And so Louis and Marie Antoinette become targets for these libels. They're pamphlets that are attacking the court and the decadence and the decrepitude. And that really sways public opinion. So more so than the fancy thoughts of Rousseau or Voltaire, like regular people are not reading political philosophy. But they are reading these just gossip rags, basically. And some of them are just like pornographic, totally graphic, depicting Marie Antoinette behind bushes. There's nobles involved. So they're really trying to sway public opinion against the old regime society. Do you guys see this movie? Kirsten Dunst playing Marie Antoinette? Yeah. It's pretty good. It's actually pretty good. So you can see she's at Versailles. She is, she's gambling. She's having fancy parties. She just plays dress up all the time. And so if you were a regular person, if you were getting pinched by the nobility who's collecting a bunch of fees, or you're a wage earner who is, you're not getting paid enough, but meanwhile you're being taxed, and these rich people aren't, you're going to be upset. So the libels really inflame public opinion, talking about all these raucous parties and how they were totally out of touch with reality. And that inflamed the Parisians especially against this like old fancy social hierarchy, and especially the court. And Marie Antoinette, she was like a poster child of everything that was wrong with that old system. So meanwhile, you've got Marie Antoinette and all the people of Versailles partying, but the fiscal system, the finances of France were in dire straits. So this is all like everything is empty, they're running out of money, and this financial collapse is going to be one of the catalysts for the revolution. What do you think their main expense was? You with the checkered. What's your name?
Art.
Tart. What do you think is the main expense of the French government in 1789?
Not exactly sure.
Just give it a guess, anything. What do you think they were spending all that money on? Because it's not like France was poor. Their exports outstripped Great Britain, but they had no money.
Like clothes or something?
Clothes or something, maybe. So actually, it turned out that only 5% went on the court. The clothes or something, all the fancy things that Marie Antoinette had in her parties, 5% went to upkeeping the court. The rest of it, a big chunk of it, 25% was just for upkeeping the army, the current army. Because remember, we studied how the armies in Europe were building up. They were getting stronger, more armaments, lots of competition. So there's a lot of current army expenditures. 50% though was war debt. So that means that they were paying off all of those wars as they were trying to get dominance over Great Britain. They were fighting with everybody. Money went to the American Revolution, for instance. So 50% of their expenditure in 1788 just went to paying off their old debts. So this is a problem. But it's not like, other people in Europe had war debts too, because everyone in Europe was trying to build up their army. The problem was the revenue wasn't keeping up with the debt. We talked about France was pretty wealthy, but what was the problem? How come they didn't have enough money to pay their debt? What was going on? What are the privileges? What are the privileges? Yep, what's your name?
They stopped taxing the royalty.
So who else? Who else did they stop not tax?
The first estate.
Good, yeah. So the first and second estate were living these privileged lives. They weren't paying the direct income tax. And it was all bore by the third estate. So that's one of the big problems. And the wage earners and the peasants, they were already pretty crunched. They couldn't pay anymore. So Louis XVI, he tries to tax the nobles. And you guys are going to study what happens when he does. And that's why the revolution, it happens. And you're going to study the exact cause and what happened. But as you're seeing, there's lots of causes that were going on in that decade before the revolution broke out. And the financial collapse was kind of like the last straw. And it gave an excuse for all this pent-up resentment, social struggle, unrest, wanting a political say. It gave an excuse for that to break out. So this is just a recap of all the causes we talked about. For instance, we've got an absolute monarchy. There's no political voice, and he's an inept ruler. We just talked about how there's a huge financial crisis, and they needed tax reform, but they didn't get it. The Enlightenment and the Revolution influenced the thought. The three estates no longer made sense. So all of this combined caused the French Revolution.